Thanks for the lead-in, Tim.
Yeah, I just,
Normally I preach the third Sunday, and I asked Tim to change to this one because I had something that I came across that I wanted to tie in, and it worked best for today, better than it would for next week. So, but I do have a caveat for my sermon today, that this you may feel like more you're in a history class than a sermon. So, most of my sermons are pretty laden with scriptures. This one only has a handful of scriptures. However, I hope you can see the power of God as I go through this story that I'm going to tell, and that you not only see the power of God, but you see the hand of God and His work as I tell you this story. August 14th, 1950. It was a Friday, about 75 years ago. It wasn't a leap year. If you were born on that day, you're a baby boomer. If you're into the signs thing, you're either a Tiger or an Aries. Francis Collins was an American physician and scientist, and he discovered some genes, and he actually led the genome, the Human Genome Project, and he was born on this day. As well as Randolph Powell, who was an actor best known for Logan's Run and Dallas. Logan's Run was a really bad 70s science fiction movie, but, anyway. So he was also born on this day. And the number one song in America on this day was Count Every Star by Hugo Winterhalter and his orchestra. An unremarkable day. Unlike the 7th of December, 1941. At 0740 in the morning, the first wave of 183 Japanese fighters reaches the shores of Oahu. And at 0749, Captain Mitsu Fushida, the Japanese aerial commander, orders the attack on Pearl Harbor. At 5 minutes after 8, the USS Arizona explodes. When it's all over, 2,403 people died, mainly military, but some civilians. 4 of the 8 battleships moored in Pearl Harbor that day were sunk, plus 8 other ships. 83 years ago today, President Roosevelt addressed the nation on the 8th of December, 1941. And he said, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. Now, if you understand the laws of this country, the president cannot declare war. That lies within the Congress. It takes an act of Congress to declare war. So Congress voted, Senate 82 to nothing, and the House 388 to 1 to go to war. That one was actually Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin from the state of Montana. If you know who she is, she was the first woman elected to Congress in 1916, 4 years before women actually had the right to vote in this country. She was elected because Montana was one of those early states that adopted women's suffrage. She was elected, so she was the one dissenter. She also dissented in the vote against World War I too. Also, so she lived her rules. She was a pacifist. But anyway, that's not the story of this. So we do go into World War II, obviously well supported. And 4 months later, on the 18th of April, 1942, we have what is known as Doolittle's Raid. You may or may not have heard about it, but you're about to hear about it. 80 men took part in this, 5 men per plane, 16 planes, and 10,000 Navy personnel to get these planes where they needed to be for this mission. It was an air raid on the Japanese capital of Tokyo and other places on the Honshu Island. And it would be the first air raid to strike the Japanese homeland. It demonstrated that Japan was vulnerable, and it served as a retaliation for Pearl Harbor. The damage to any Japanese military and industrial targets was minimal, but it provided an important boost to the U.S. morale. And it was planned and led by Lieutenant Colonel James or Jimmy Doolittle. And it was 16 B-25 bombers, medium bombers, launched without fighter escort from an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. And if you didn't know, bombers generally don't fly off of carriers. This was specifically done for this mission. The plan called to bomb military targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, and to continue west to land in China. Understanding history, China and Japan were at war also. Japan actually occupied parts of China. China was sort of our ally in this. That's why we'd fly and land there. And landing a medium bomber on the Hornet was impossible. So the 15 aircraft reached China-ish, and the other one landed in the Soviet Union. So what happened? So they planned to launch about 400 miles from Japan, but they were spotted about 650 miles out, so they launched immediately. Fuel to make China was dicey at best, but they still all loaded up, all took off. They all made their bombing runs. One plane had run out of fuel, couldn't land. Everybody had to bail out. One man was killed on bailout. One plane didn't even make it to the coast of China, had to ditch into the water. 2 men drowned. 8 men were eventually captured by the Japanese. 4 of them died during that occupation or that capture. And the 5 men that landed in Russia were captured and released back to the U.S. in 1943. That's a whole nother story. We're not going to cover that one today. We're going to talk about Crew 16. We're going to talk about George Barr, Bill Farrell, Harold Spatz, Robert Hite, and Jacob DeShazer. And they left the deck of the Hornet 59 minutes after Doolittle. They were the last plane. Doolittle was obviously in the first plane. He was leading the charge. They took off 59 minutes after them. Their fate is intertwined with crew number 6. So Crew 16's mission was to bomb an oil storage tanks and aircraft factory in Nagoya, Japan. And Crew 6 was to bomb a steel mill outside of Tokyo. And we're going to further focus this story as we get to it on a man named Jacob DeShazer. He was 27. He was from Oregon, 27. Remember, this is a Depression-era economy. He joined the service in 1940, U.S. Army Air Corps, to be an airplane mechanic. Somewhere along the way, he decided to change in his wrenches, and he wanted to be trained as a bombardier. So he went to bombardier school. And on the 7th of December, 1941, while he was at bombardier school, he heard on the radio while he was doing KP duties about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he exclaimed, "Japan is going to pay for this." He didn't have a hatred for Japan before then, but he now had a hatred for Japan. Crew 6 and Crew 16 were captured by the Japanese. And we know there was 10, but it was only 8 because 2 had died in the water. So Crew 6 was the one that landed in the water. 3 of them managed to get to shore, but they were eventually captured. So 8 of them were captured by the Japanese. And during DeShazer's time in prison, he saw the absolute cruelty of his captors. He was beaten often and regularly and malnourished, underfed. Hallmark, Farrow, and Spates were all executed by firing squad in October 1942. DeShazer's hatred towards the Japanese grew deeper and more intense. He saw his friends executed, he's being beaten, he's underfed. A little over a year later, another one of his friends in captivity, Robert Meter, died of starvation. But something happened. Due to Meter's death, DeShazer began searching for answers about hatred, and he requested a Bible. He didn't get that Bible until May of 1944. And then he only had it for 3 weeks. But he had it for that short time. But he saw its message and the reason for his survival and resolved to become a devout Christian. His conversion included learning a few words of Japanese and treating his captors with respect. Which resulted in the guards reacting in a similar fashion. Jesus told us on the Sermon on the Mount, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." In January 1942, Fushida, the one who called the raid at Pearl Harbor, designed the aerial attack against Rabaul, which was the beginning of the invasion of New Guinea. And he said it felt like a hunter sent to stalk a mouse with an elephant gun. He also led the attack in Darwin, Australia. He also led the attack in April, British naval forces in the Indian Ocean. Then comes the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. He was unable to participate. He had an appendicitis. So Japan's greatest aerial commander was not able to perform in the duties of that battle that day. He was actually on the flagship, the carrier Akagi. He was recovering from his appendicitis. We had struck the Akagi. He was blown out into sea. He was rescued, hospitalized. The Akagi sank. He survived the day. But the Battle of Midway was a U.S. victory and the turning point of the war in the Pacific. In June of 43, he became a senior staff officer for the 1st Air Fleet, and in April of 44, he became a staff officer for air operations for all of the Japanese Navy. About a little over a year later, he's in Hiroshima in August attending a military conference. If anybody recognizes that month and that city, well, he was abruptly summoned to Tokyo. And what happens the next day? The Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August. The following day, so on the 7th of August, Fushida is a part of an assessment team to go down there and survey the damage. Everybody on that assessment team dies of radiation poisoning except Fushida. Barr, Nielsen, Haidt, and DeShazer are all rescued from their POW camp on the 20th of August, 1945. Barr stays in the service till 47, dies in 67. Nielsen stays in till 61, dies in 2007. Haidt stays in the military until 1969 and doesn't die until 2015. DeShazer would spend time in different POW camps, total of 40 months. Of those 40 months, 34 were in solitary confinement. Can you imagine being locked in a room by yourself for 34 months out of 40? Very little human contact. But in the early morning of September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally surrenders and World War II is over. So Jacob DeShazer is released from active duty on the 15th of October, about a month later. He entered Seattle Pacific College, which is now Seattle Pacific University, a Christian college associated with the Free Methodist denomination, with the sole intent to return to Japan and spread Christianity. Imagine, this man just got out of a prisoner of war camp that he had spent 34 out of 40 months in isolation, beaten, malnourished, saw friends murdered, a friend starved to death, and he comes back, and what does he do? He enrolls in a Christian university to do what? Take the message of God back, not stay here, back to where he came from, to spread the word of God. He wasn't on campus long. They asked him to give a speech. I mean, that's going from a prison camp to giving a speech on Armistice Day. We now call it Veterans Day. But he gave this speech, and he said, hardest part of being a Christian in a Japanese prison was not to be resentful. And he looks forward to returning to Japan and helping some of those same people to a saving knowledge of Christ. And given a willing heart, God can save, sanctify, and direct any person willing to pay the price. Peter told us, "In this you rejoice, though now, for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials." Just think about that with Jacob de Shazer. What he suffered, various trials. To rejoice. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes through it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. At war's end, Fushida went back home to his wife and his children outside of Osaka, sullen and bitter over Japan's defeat. He became a farmer. He was once this great military officer looked upon. He was the hero to the country of Pearl Harbor and to many battles. And now he's a farmer, a nobody. Civilian life to him, in his words, was a path of thorns. He was bitter and disillusioned. Why had he survived when others didn't? Was there a higher power protecting him? As he toiled in the ground, he got to be thinking about a creator God as he planted his little plants and played in the dirt. During the war, he crashed his airplane 6 times in the ocean. 3 of those times, he was rescued by the same Chinese junk, which is a sailing ship, not a piece of junk. Pearl Harbor, his plane had 21 bullet holes, yet he suffered no injuries. Remember what happened to him at Midway and what happened to him at Hiroshima. The war is over. The International Military Tribunal Far East was convened by General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers. It took opening statements on the 3rd of May, 1946, and ran until November of 1948. Fushida, he was never put on trial, but questioned why they had the trials. War was war, right? Stuff happens. But he was called on to testify several times. And he was even called to testify on some charges about prisoner abuse. And he thought, surely Japanese prisoners were treated as poorly and abusively as American prisoners were treated. We saw what happened to Jacob de Shazer. That had to happen to his Japanese fellows in American hands, right? The arrogance of the tribunal. This whole process infuriated him as he believed this was little more than victors' justice. Jacob meets Florence while in college, and in August of 1946, they get married. Also in 1946, he publishes a leaflet about his life of occupation, being a prisoner of war, and his conversion to Christianity during that time. Makes it into a leaflet, and it gets distributed in Japan. Mind you, he's still in college at this time, but his message is already going out to the Japanese people by American missionaries. So 1947, Fushida heard the Japanese POWs are returning from America. He went to Aruga Harbor to collect evidence of the atrocities against POWs to mock the trials. He's going to go find the evidence that his people are being treated as badly as they treated Americans. It so happens he ran into somebody he knew, a lieutenant friend that he actually thought was dead after the Battle of Midway. And I'm going to call him Kaz because I can't pronounce the rest of his name. Surely he would now hear true tales of cruelty that he could take back and throw in the face of the tribunal. But Kaz's answer was this: I never experienced nor saw atrocities at American camps. No, I was always treated kindly. And then he tells them another story. The Covilles, Baptist ministers, James and Jarma, had 3 children, Margaret, David, and Alice. Margaret went by the name of Peggy also. They lived in Japan, in Yokohama, 1922 to 1939. Tensions started up So James took his family and they went to the Philippines. Still getting tense, he sent his children back to America. Him and Sharma stayed in the Philippines doing missionary work. Peggy was about 17 at this time, sent the kids back to America. 8th of December of 1941. What happened on the 7th of December? On the 8th of December, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. Kind of a plan there? So James and Sharma and other missionaries go to the mountains outside of Luzon to hide from the Japanese. And they're there for a couple of years until, as you see, the Hopevale martyrs. They were caught by the Japanese, tried as spies in late December, and on 19th of December 1943, men, women, and children all beheaded. All these missionaries and doing good works as spies. And there's various stories of the Covils on the Google machine. And it's kind of hard to worm them together, and I'm going to do my best. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how this all came together and how Kaz found and spoke to Peggy, because it's kind of diluted out there. But this is the best I could come up with, because the gentleman is continuing his story with Fushida, and he tells him about Peggy. He's telling him the story. Now he gets more in detail about Peggy. It says, Peggy learned of her parents' execution in the spring of 1944. So her parents were killed in December. She did not find out for several months while she was a senior in college. I can't pronounce that college name, but it's in that same town in New York, the little white spot on the map. She grew some anger there, knowing that her parents, missionaries doing God's work, were just murdered for doing God's work. She had a hatred for the Japanese. And she worked through that hatred and grief. She felt the Lord's leading to do the thing that would stress her forgiveness the most, that would eliminate her hatred of the Japanese. She realized that her parents would have been the first to forgive them and pray for their souls. Remember that comment. Following their example, she moved west to aid Japanese Americans interned in Colorado. Camp closed. She made it way to Bushnell Hospital, where they had Japanese POWs, and that's where I believe that they would have ran into each other to tell this story. As Kaz added to the story, before the soldiers beheaded her parents asked for and were granted 30 minutes to pray for their executioners. When asked why she would provide aid to Japanese POW, they did this atrocity to parents. Why in the world would you do anything to help these people? And her answer, because Japanese soldiers killed my parents. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. She found that forgiveness in her heart. That is tough. Just a side note, Bushnell Hospital was one of the first medical facilities in the country to use penicillin. We think it's a common drug now, was not so back then. It was kind of experimental. But Fushida, here's this story. He absolutely could not understand this enemy forgiving love. But what he did understand, what his country needed, was to get out of that warrior mentality which he had grown up with into a doctrine of peace after the war. And he wanted to write a book, No More Pearl Harbor, but he wasn't sure how to do it, how to transform hatred to brotherly love. He wanted to find the source of power to make such a change in a person from hatred to love. So Jacob graduated from Seattle Pacific College in June of 1948 with his bachelor's and getting ready to go on his missionary journey. He and Florence actually go to Japan on 28 December 1948 to fulfill that vision that he had. He was on his way to do his missionary work. In between that, in October 48, Fushida was called again to testify. On his way, he passed through the Cebu station. And a man that was later identified to him, he did not know the man's name at this time, his name was Timothy Peach, handed him DeShazer's leaflet. DeShazer's story definitely piqued the spiritual interest of Fashida. So about a year later, he's passing through Cebu Station again, and he decided if the Bible could change DeShazer's life, the Bible could change his. Remember, this is somebody coming from a military Buddhist train of thought, thinks that the Bible could change his life, so he purchases one. He doesn't purchase the whole Bible, it just happens to be the New Testament he gets. So about a year later, Fushida's reading. If you know this, what day? He's reading in Luke. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He understood Jesus was praying for his executioners. Fushida stated that on April 14th, 1950, that unremarkable day, I became a new person. My complete view of life changed by the intervention of the Christ I had always hated and ignored before. Just as Paul tells the Corinthians, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, behold, the new has come. He finally and fully understood the stories of forgiveness and change of heart that Peggy Covell and Jacob DeShazer had. Here is the source of power to change hatred to love. Jesus says, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. He was baptized in 1951. I hope most of the people know who that was. Fushida contacted Timothy Peach about meeting DeShazer. He had to meet the man that he read the pamphlet from. Has just happened, he happened to be in Japan. So about a month later, Fushida and DeShazer meet and become lifelong friends. Fushida said, moreover, I think I can say today, without hesitation, that God's grace has been constantly set upon me and guided me even before I knew Christ. Think of all the things that he went through, and he was still alive to make this meeting. God has revealed to me the way of salvation through the atoning blood of Christ, Jesus Christ. I decided to believe whatever is revealed in the Bible, accept it, and stand as his witness, telling others this truth with the help of the Lord. So the DeShazers did spend about 30 years in Japan bringing their word on his mission. They had a few times back in the States, but mostly almost 30 years, spreading the gospel message of love and forgiveness. Planting churches, including one in Nagoya, the town that he bombed, and happily bombed at the time, and raising their family of 3 sons and 2 daughters. He even reconciled with 2 of his former prison guards. Can you imagine driving around in Spokane with the car with loudspeakers on, broadcasting the message of Christ as he did, going around in Japan? Or standing up on a mic on a street corner and getting that crowd with the message of Christ? Here he is with his family in Nagoya, the house they bought in Nagoya, again, the town he bombed. And almost 30 years missionary work in Japan to bring the word of the Lord to the people who had abused him and murdered his friends. He gave that forgiveness. When they left Japan in 1977, he retired back to Oregon. Fushida was true to his word. He began to tell others. He told them he'd found the answer to despair and defeat. He told them God had come to not lead armies, but to lead men and women out of hatred and into love. The word of the conversion of the nation's hero reached the media and the torrent burst. He received hate mail, abusive phone calls, threats to his family. He had betrayed his country and accepted the foreigner's God. Even old friends turned away from him on the street corner. but for the remainder of his life, he was dedicated to evangelical activities in Japan, the United States, and all over the world. He authored books, gave interviews, delivered speeches. 1952, he was touring the U.S. as a member of the Worldwide Christian Missionary Army of Sky Pilots. Declared himself an ambassador of peace. He even met General James Doolittle, the commander of the Doolittle Raid. Swapped some war stories, I'm sure, based on this picture. He even wrote a book, From Pearl Harbor to Golgotha, in January 1953. It was re-released as From Pearl Harbor to Calvary, with a foreword from Florence DeShazer. Jacob's wife wrote the foreword to the book. He even wrote his own little leaflet for distribution about his conversion to Christianity, titled, I Bombed Pearl Harbor. He was even offered a position in the Japanese government to organize the new Air Force. He turned it down to continue to evangelize. He was threatened by people. 1959, happened to be in Florida on a conference, and he met General Paul Tibbets. Tibbets was the one who piloted the Enola Gay that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, where he was the day before and the day after. He even traveled back to his house for a few weeks. He met some influential Christian people, whatever you think of Billy Graham, he ran into him. He went over to England and spoke to them. See the name on the chalkboard that he wrote? He told the story. He was impacted. It is no secret what God can do. He was even on the Merv Griffith show. I'm sure some of you out there watched the Merv Griffith show. He was on Merv Griffith. For whatever reason, he was invited to the British opening of Tora, 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 which is the 1970 movie. Some of us, I have seen it. Some of you may have. It is about the attack at Pearl Harbor. So, and then he had an interview with Jacob DeShazer later in their life, 1975. As I'm wrapping this up, Colonel Cole, 103 years old, co-pilot of Doolittle's plane, crew number 1, was the last remaining Doolittle Raider. Died April of 2019, not that long ago. So some other days in infamy. How about when Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden? The birth of Jesus, the death of Jesus, his ascension into heaven, and the day that we are all waiting for, the return of the King. So these two former enemies shared a bond of faith that grew out of hatred. From war, from atrocity, they found life in the Bible through the scriptures separately. They came together. Their friendship reveals the power of Christ to change hearts. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So I just want to leave you with the words from Jacob DeShazer's speech after we returned. Given a willing heart, God can save, sanctify, and direct any person. Look at the circumstances they went through. All three of those people went through to continue to love God. Direct any person willing to pay the price. I encourage us to have that willing heart and willing to pay whatever the price to follow Christ. So if you have any needs of the church, you can bring them forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.